The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, constituted a profound economic transformation of France, affecting land tenure, fiscal structures, monetary policy, industrial production, and trade networks. The economic backdrop of the revolution included long-standing fiscal deficits, rising public debt, and social inequality in the taxation system. By the late 1780s, the French monarchy had accumulated debt exceeding 4 billion livres, with annual interest payments consuming roughly half of state revenues. The taxation system was highly inequitable. The clergy and nobility enjoyed exemptions from direct taxation, while peasants and the urban poor bore the majority of tax burdens. The Ancien regime's fiscal inefficiency, coupled with recurring harvest failures between 1787 and 1789, contributed to widespread economic distress in rural and urban areas, creating conditions for structural reform. One of the revolution's earliest economic measures was the abolition of feudal privileges on August 4, 1789. This eliminated seigneurial dues, corvée labor obligations, and other feudal rights that had previously required peasants to render payments in grain, livestock, or labor to their local lords. The formal elimination of these dues legally liberated approximately 25 million peasants from feudal obligations. However, this legal emancipation introduced new economic pressures, as peasants were required to purchase plots of land previously controlled by the nobility or the church. Land sales, conducted through nationalized property auctions, mobilized significant capital flows, but also generated liquidity constraints for smallholders. Typical peasant holdings acquired during this period ranged from 2 to 15 hectares, with regional variation reflecting historical land distribution patterns. Northern and central France generally had smaller fragmented holdings, while southern regions, such as Languedoc, contained larger estates that were often subdivided among multiple buyers. The redistribution of land was accompanied by structural changes in agricultural practice. Smallholders often lacked the financial resources to invest in modern tools or livestock, limiting immediate productivity gains. Credit institutions, including local municipal banks and private lenders, became central to enabling land purchases and farm improvements, but interest rates were often high, exceeding 10% annually in some rural districts. Agricultural outputs varied regionally. Wheat production in northern France declined by an estimated 5 to 7% in the immediate post-revolutionary period due to transitional inefficiencies, whereas vineyards in the Midi region maintained stable output levels owing to established management structures. Urban economies faced parallel disruptions. Guild structures in towns had previously regulated artisanal production and controlled the quality and pricing of goods, including textiles, metalwork, and leather. The 1791 Sierra Leonean Lyons Chapelier law abolished guild privileges, enabling freer entry into artisanal trades, but also introducing competition pressures. Urban artisans in cities such as Lyon, Rouen, and Paris encountered reduced market stability as traditional client networks were disrupted. Industrial production in textiles remained concentrated in Lyon and the surrounding Rhône-Alpes region, with approximately 60,000 looms in operation by 1790, employing an estimated 150,000 workers. Fiscal reform was central to the revolutionary economic agenda. In addition to abolishing feudal dues, the National Assembly sought to rationalize taxation by instituting uniform levies on land and income. The contribution foncière, imposed on landowners, and the contribution mobilier, applied to commercial and urban property, were designed to replace the patchwork of feudal dues and privileges. Nonetheless, tax collection remained uneven due to administrative disorganization and resistance in provinces. Attempts to finance the state included the nationalization and sale of church property, estimated at 3.5 billion livres. These sales, conducted in multiple phases between 1790 and 1792, generated significant short-term revenue, but also introduced inflationary pressures. To address liquidity needs, the revolutionary government issued assignats, paper notes backed by the value of confiscated church lands. Initially, assignats facilitated the sale of nationalized property and provided medium of exchange stability. However, excessive issuance, combined with speculative trading, caused rapid depreciation. By 1795, assignats had lost more than 80% of their face value relative to specie, producing hyperinflation that undermined urban purchasing power and constrained the rural market economy. Urban wages, while nominally stable, failed to keep pace with price increases, reducing real incomes for artisans and laborers. In rural areas, peasants increasingly resorted to barter or in-kind transactions, as assignat value became unreliable for market exchanges. Trade networks suffered from both domestic and international disruptions. Internally, roads and river transport were frequently obstructed by political unrest, while provincial markets faced unpredictable tax and toll regimes imposed by local revolutionary authorities. Externally, the outbreak of hostilities with European powers, including Austria and Prussia, restricted exports of textiles, luxury goods, and agricultural produce. French ports, including Marseille, Bordeaux, and Nantes, saw declines in shipping tonnage by 20 to 25% during the early 1790s, reducing both the import of raw materials such as cotton and the export of manufactured textiles. Merchants and shipowners adapted by focusing on coastal trade and domestic distribution, though profitability remained constrained. The industrial organization experienced a significant transformation. Textile workshops in Lyon shifted towards small-scale, family-operated production units, replacing larger, guild-regulated workshops. In metallurgy, regional foundries in Lorraine and Alsace diversified into armaments manufacturing, responding to rising demand from revolutionary armies. By 1794, France maintained approximately 60 major ironworks and 120 smaller workshops producing both civilian and military goods. Armaments production was prioritized, with an estimated 50,000 muskets manufactured annually to supply revolutionary forces. Artisanal crafts, including carpentry, leatherworking, and shoemaking, saw employment increases in urban centers as former guild restrictions were removed, though wage stability remained precarious due to inflationary pressures. The economic landscape was also shaped by demographic changes. Population estimates in 1789 indicated approximately 28 million inhabitants, with urban residents constituting around 15%. During the revolutionary period, migration from rural to urban centers increased modestly, driven by political instability and the search for economic opportunities in workshops and military supply industries. The demographic shift contributed to labor availability in cities, but also intensified competition for limited housing and resources. Internationally, France's economic interactions were constrained by both revolutionary policies and war. The suspension of royal monopolies and colonial trading privileges initially disrupted trade with Caribbean colonies, particularly Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, which accounted for roughly 40% of French sugar imports before the Revolution. The slave revolt in Saint-Domingue further curtailed sugar and coffee imports, contributing to domestic shortages and price volatility. Exports of textiles to European markets declined as revolutionary conflicts limited access to traditional trading partners, including Britain, the Dutch Republic, and the German states. Diplomatic embargoes and wartime blockades further compounded these disruptions, forcing French manufacturers to reorient production toward domestic consumption and military supply. By the close of the 1790s, the revolutionary economy displayed both structural change and persistent instability. Land redistribution had created a more widespread base of smallholders, but imposed significant capital requirements. Fiscal reforms attempted to rationalize taxation, but struggled with administrative inefficiency and political resistance. Industrial and artisanal sectors experienced regulatory liberalization, which increased participation and innovation potential, yet output remained uneven and vulnerable to inflation and market disruption. Trade networks, both internal and external, were heavily affected by political unrest, war, and global market disruptions, requiring adaptation by producers and merchants. Monetary policy, dominated by assignats, exemplified the challenges of financing revolutionary priorities while maintaining economic stability. Following the period of revolutionary upheaval, the French economy entered a phase of partial stabilization under the Consulate and later the Napoleonic Empire between 1799 and 1815. The transition from revolutionary to Napoleonic governance brought changes in legal, fiscal, and industrial structures, while ongoing military campaigns and international conflicts imposed significant constraints on economic activity. The Napoleonic government pursued policies aimed at consolidating property rights, modernizing commercial law, and regulating industrial production to support both civilian and military needs. A central component of economic reform was the enactment of the Napoleonic Code in 1804, formally known as the Code Civil. The code standardized property rights, commercial contracts, inheritance regulations, and obligations, replacing the fragmented and inconsistent local laws inherited from the Ancien regime and revolutionary decrees. By establishing legal security over land, capital, and contractual arrangements, the code facilitated investment in agriculture, industry, and commerce. Between 1804 and 1815, estimates indicate that approximately 6 million landowners operated under legally codified property rights, including smallholders who had acquired land during the revolutionary redistribution. The clarity of property tenure contributed to increased agricultural efficiency, with some regions reporting wheat yields rising by 5 to 10% per hectare due to more secure tenure and the ability to make long-term investments. Industrial production during this period remained concentrated in textiles, metallurgy, and armaments, reflecting both structural continuity from pre-revolutionary patterns and the strategic priorities of the Napoleonic state. Textile production was concentrated in Lyon, with an estimated 70,000 looms operational by 1810, employing approximately 180,000 workers, a moderate increase from the Revolutionary period. Cotton imports, primarily from the United States and India, were initially disrupted by wartime blockades, compelling Lyons manufacturers to rely increasingly on domestically produced flax and wool. Metallurgical production in Lorraine and Alsace expanded in response to military demand. Iron production, which had been approximately 45,000 tons annually in 1799, increased to nearly 55,000 tons by 1812, partly driven by the needs of artillery, cannon, and bridge construction for military campaigns. Regional foundries in the Northeast employed approximately 20,000 skilled laborers, with additional employment generated in ancillary industries such as coal mining, charcoal production, and transport. The Napoleonic administration also actively intervened in the allocation of resources to support industrial and military priorities. Military manufacturing centers, including the Forges de Charleville and Saint-Étienne arms factories, produced approximately 50,000 muskets annually during the 1800s and expanded to 80,000 by 1813. Gunpowder production increased correspondingly, with French arsenals generating over 15,000 tons annually by the later years of the empire. This focus on military-industrial output required a substantial labor shift, drawing artisans, metallurgists, and miners into state-controlled or state-contracted workshops, while urban workshops producing civilian goods were partially redirected toward military production. The Continental System, implemented between 1806 and 1814, imposed a comprehensive economic blockade aimed at disrupting British trade throughout Europe. Under this system, French-controlled territories and allied states were prohibited from importing British goods or engaging in commercial transactions with British merchants. While the blockade was intended to strengthen domestic industry and deprive Britain of markets, it created substantial economic disruption. Imports of cotton, wool, and coal were restricted, impacting textile and metallurgical production. Estimates suggest that French imports of raw cotton fell by approximately 25% during the first years of the blockade, while iron ore imports from Sweden and Britain declined by roughly 30%. Coastal port cities, including Le Havre, Bordeaux, and Nantes, experienced declines in shipping tonnage of 20 to 30%, reflecting both blockade enforcement and British naval control of the Atlantic. Merchant shipping employment fell proportionally, with approximately 10,000 to 15,000 sailors temporarily displaced in major ports. Smuggling and black market trade partially mitigated the impact, with contraband imports from neutral countries such as the Netherlands and the United States estimated to account for 15 to 20% of pre-blockade trade volumes. Agriculture continued to play a central role in the French economy during the Napoleonic period. Approximately 75% of the population remained engaged in farming in 1800, with cereal production providing the majority of caloric intake. Land reform from the Revolutionary period facilitated investment in improved tools, draft animals, and irrigation systems, particularly in northern and central France. Yields per hectare in wheat-growing regions increased modestly, with northern France achieving approximately 20 hectoliters per hectare by 1812. Viticulture and wine production in regions such as Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Midi remained significant for both domestic consumption and export. Though trade restrictions under the Continental System limited overseas sales, reducing export volumes by an estimated 30% relative to pre-1806 levels. Livestock production remained regionally uneven. The Massif Central and Pyrenees maintained substantial herds of cattle and sheep, supporting regional meat and wool industries. Fiscal and monetary policy under Napoleon reflected both the need to finance continuous military campaigns and the desire to stabilize the currency. State expenditure on warfare and administration averaged approximately 600 million francs annually between 1804 and 1812, representing more than 40% of estimated national output. Direct taxation, including the contribution foncière and the contribution mobilière, was supplemented by excise duties, customs tariffs, and indirect levies on luxury goods. Public debt increased steadily, reaching approximately 6 billion francs by 1812. The government also stabilized currency through the maintenance of the franc germinal, introduced in 1803, which re-established the gold-silver standard and improved confidence in coinage. The franc germinal, valued at 4.5 grams of silver per franc, provided a reliable medium for domestic transactions, in contrast to the hyperinflated assignats of the Revolutionary period. Trade and transportation infrastructure received targeted improvements. Roads and canals were upgraded to facilitate the movement of military supplies, agricultural produce, and industrial goods. The Canal du Midi and newly constructed canals in northern France allowed for bulk transport of coal, iron, and grain, reducing costs by approximately 20% relative to overland transport. Paris and Lyon, as principal urban centers, benefited from road improvements that enhanced both commercial activity and regional market integration. River transport on the Seine, Loire, and Rhone enabled more efficient distribution of goods to ports for limited overseas trade, although the Continental System and British naval dominance restricted exports to neutral or allied nations. Demographic and labor patterns were influenced by both economic and military factors. Urban population growth continued, with Paris's population reaching roughly 600,000 by 1812, supported by migration from rural regions. Industrial labor in workshops, foundries, and textile factories accounted for approximately 250,000 workers, including skilled artisans and semi-skilled laborers. Agricultural labor remained dominant, but conscription and military campaigns periodically reduced available manpower, requiring the temporary reallocation of women, children, and older men to farm work. Wage structures reflected both inflationary pressures from earlier assignat depreciation and relative stability under the franc germinal. Urban wages in Lyon and Paris ranged from 15 to 25 francs per month for unskilled workers, while skilled artisans earned 50 to 70 francs monthly, providing moderate purchasing power in stabilized markets. Colonial trade continued to have indirect effects on the French economy. Although the Caribbean colonies were affected by ongoing slave revolts and the disruption of sugar production, France attempted to maintain commercial linkages through alternative channels, including trade with Dutch and neutral Caribbean ports. Sugar imports declined by an estimated 35% during the period, while coffee and indigo imports fell by 25 to 30%, influencing domestic prices and urban consumption patterns. French colonial policy also emphasized resource extraction from newly acquired territories in Europe, and Italy, including timber, salt, and agricultural products, which contributed modestly to supply chains supporting both civilian and military needs. By the end of the Napoleonic period in 1815, France had achieved partial stabilization of its economy relative to the revolutionary decade, although military expenditure, trade restrictions, and labor pressures maintained structural challenges. Industrial output had increased moderately, particularly in textiles, metallurgy, and military manufacturing. Agricultural production showed incremental improvements due to secure property rights, local investment, and the use of draft animals and improved implements. The franc germinal provided a reliable monetary system, facilitating trade and domestic market activity. However, the Continental System, ongoing warfare, and external blockades limited full commercial integration with Europe and constrained colonial trade. Urban populations and industrial laborers had increased, but wage levels and purchasing power. The economic developments of the Napoleonic era set the stage for subsequent growth during the Restoration period. Industrial organization, regional specialization, and infrastructural improvements established production patterns that persisted into the 19th century. Legal and fiscal reforms created the foundation for long-term property security and commercial activity. Military priorities had redirected labor and capital toward armaments and associated industries, shaping skill distribution and industrial capacity across regions. Trade adaptations under the Continental System influenced merchant networks, domestic production orientation, and supply chains, leaving a legacy of economic restructuring that would influence both the July Monarchy and later industrialization. Following the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, France entered the Bourbon Restoration, a period characterized by political conservatism and gradual economic reconstruction. The Treaty of Paris, 1815, imposed restrictions on French military power and territorial adjustments, while reparations payments and indemnities created additional fiscal pressures. The French economy, recovering from decades of revolution and warfare, required the stabilization of agriculture, reconstruction of infrastructure, and the reorganization of industry to re-establish production, trade, and urban labor markets. Agricultural production, which had experienced disruptions during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, underwent stabilization and modest growth during the Restoration. By 1820, estimates indicate that approximately 70% of the population remained engaged in farming, with cereal production accounting for the majority of caloric intake. Wheat yields in northern France averaged roughly 22 hectoliters per hectare, reflecting incremental improvements due to secure land tenure and the gradual adoption of modern farming implements such as iron plows and seed drills imported from Britain. Crop rotation systems, combining wheat, legumes, and fodder crops, were increasingly implemented, particularly in the Loire and Beauce regions, contributing to soil fertility and incremental yield increases. Viticulture in regions such as Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Rhône Valley recovered from wartime disruptions, with wine exports gradually rising to pre-revolutionary levels by the late 1820s, though trade remained vulnerable to regional and international market fluctuations. Land ownership patterns established during the revolutionary period continued to shape agricultural and economic development. Smallholders retained approximately 60% of redistributed plots, typically ranging from 2 to 15 hectares, with larger holdings concentrated in southern France. Investment in drainage, fencing, and livestock increased modestly, supported by private lenders, municipal credit associations, and the recently stabilized Banque de France. The Banque de France, re-established in 1800 under Napoleon, maintained the franc germinal as the national currency, providing financial stability for investment in agriculture and emerging industries. By 1825, the Banque de France held reserves exceeding 500 million francs, allowing for credit expansion and stabilizing commercial transactions, which facilitated rural and urban market integration. Industrial development during the Restoration period progressed unevenly across regions, reflecting historical, geographic, and resource-based factors. Northern France, particularly the Nord-Pas-de-Calais and the industrial corridors surrounding Lille, Lens, and Valenciennes, saw expansion in coal mining, iron production, and textiles. Coal output increased from approximately 1.2 million tons in 1815 to 2.5 million tons by 1840, supporting both metallurgical and urban industrial needs. Iron production, concentrated in Lorraine and Alsace, rose from roughly 50,000 tons annually in 1815 to 75,000 tons by 1845, reflecting increased demand from infrastructure projects and manufacturing. Textile production, particularly in Lyon and surrounding areas, expanded moderately, with the number of operational looms reaching approximately 80,000 by 1840 and employing 200,000 workers, including women and children who were integrated into factory labor. Urbanization accelerated during this period, driven by industrial expansion, labor migration, and population growth. Paris, Lyon, and Lille experienced steady population increases, with Paris's population rising from 714,000 in 1815 to approximately 935,000 by 1846. Urban labor markets expanded in both industrial and artisanal sectors, encompassing textile manufacturing, metallurgy, construction, and trade services. Semi-skilled and unskilled workers, often migrants from rural regions, constituted the majority of the industrial workforce, while skilled artisans and engineers directed production, maintained machinery, and oversaw operations. Wages in urban centers ranged from 20 to 30 francs per month for unskilled laborers, and 50 to 80 francs per month for skilled artisans, with regional variations reflecting the cost of living, labor supply, and industrial concentration. Infrastructure development was a priority of the Restoration governments, aimed at facilitating trade, supporting industrial growth, and integrating regional markets. Road networks were repaired and expanded, with national roads linking Paris to regional centers and northern ports. Canal construction, including expansions to the Canal de Saint-Quentin and the Canal du Centre, enabled bulk transport of coal, iron, and agricultural products, reducing overland transport costs by approximately 15 to 20%. Ports in Le Havre, Nantes, and Marseille were modernized to support both internal and international trade, including the export of wine, textiles, and colonial goods such as sugar, coffee, and indigo. Trade volumes gradually recovered from revolutionary disruption, with exports estimated at 250 million francs annually by the late 1820s, rising to over 400 million francs by the 1840s, while imports reached similar levels, reflecting re-established commercial networks with Britain, the Netherlands, and Mediterranean partners. The Restoration also witnessed early technological adoption in industry. In textile production, mechanical spinning and power looms began to replace hand-operated equipment in Lyon and northern France, although mechanization remained limited compared to Britain. Steam engines, primarily imported from Britain and adapted for local conditions, were increasingly employed in ironworks and textile mills. By 1840, An estimated 150 steam engines operated in French industry, with a combined capacity of approximately 4,000 horsepower, enhancing production efficiency and reducing reliance on water power in regions with variable river flows. Metallurgical enterprises adopted coke-fired blast furnaces in Lorraine, increasing iron yield by 10 to 15% relative to earlier charcoal-based methods. These technical developments laid the foundation for broader industrial expansion during the subsequent July Monarchy. Fiscal and monetary policy under the Restoration remained influenced by the need to service war debt and maintain social stability. Government expenditure averaged approximately 500 million francs annually, covering debt servicing, administration, and limited public works. Taxation was structured through direct land and commercial levies, supplemented by excise duties on salt, wine, and luxury goods. Indirect taxation, accounting for roughly 35% of revenue, affected both rural and urban populations, contributing to modest inflation but maintaining relative stability under the Franc Germinal. The government occasionally intervened to regulate grain markets, particularly in years of poor harvests, using local granaries to stabilize urban food prices. Financial institutions expanded during this period to support both industrial and agricultural activity. The Banque de France increased lending to manufacturers, textile entrepreneurs, and rural landowners, providing short-term credit for working capital and investment in machinery or land improvement. By 1845, outstanding industrial loans were estimated at 150 million francs, concentrated in northern France, Lyon, and Paris. Private banking houses, often based in Paris, supplemented public credit, facilitating the acquisition of raw materials, export transactions, and infrastructure contracts. Joint stock companies, emerging in limited numbers, invested in canal construction, railways, and industrial enterprises, signaling early integration of modern financial mechanisms into the French economy. Population dynamics during the Restoration influenced labor supply and market demand. France's population increased from approximately 28.5 million in 1815 to nearly 32 million by 1846, with urbanization rising in response to industrial labor demand. Rural areas maintained a high density of smallholders and tenant farmers, while younger generations migrated to urban centers to work in textile factories, ironworks, and construction projects. Mortality and fertility rates remained high, with urban centers facing challenges in housing, sanitation, and the provision of municipal services. The demographic structure supported expanding labor markets, particularly in regions undergoing industrial concentration, while maintaining substantial agricultural labor for food production. International connections continued to affect the French economy during the Restoration. Following the Napoleonic Wars, trade resumed with Britain, the Netherlands, and Mediterranean markets, although tariff barriers and competition from industrializing Britain constrained full integration. France imported cotton, coal, and manufactured machinery, while exporting textiles, wine, and colonial goods. By 1830, approximately 60% of imported cotton originated from British India and the United States, reflecting adaptation to new global supply chains. Colonial trade, particularly with the Caribbean and North Africa, contributed roughly 15% of French export value, while imports of sugar, coffee, and indigo provided essential commodities for urban consumption. Shipping volumes from major ports recovered to pre-revolutionary levels. with Le Havre handling approximately 350,000. Railways emerged toward the latter part of the Restoration as a component of early industrial infrastructure. The Saint-Étienne to Lyon Railway, constructed with partial state and private investment beginning in 1827, represented the first major line intended to facilitate industrial transport of coal, iron, and manufactured goods. By 1845, roughly 150 kilometers of railway track were operational, employing approximately 3,000 workers and reducing transport costs for bulk goods by 20 to 25% relative to canal or road transport. Early railway development demonstrated the integration of new technology into regional economies and set the stage for rapid expansion under the July Monarchy in the 1848 to 1870 period. Social and labor structures adapted to industrial expansion, with the coexistence of traditional artisanal workshops and emerging factory systems. Lyon's textile workshops employed a mix of skilled weavers, semi-skilled assistants, and female and child laborers, producing silk, cotton, and wool products for domestic and limited international markets. Northern industrial centers similarly relied on hierarchical labor structures, with foremen and technical supervisors overseeing manual labor in ironworks, coal mines, and textile mills. Labor mobility remained constrained by family obligations and rural ties, though migration to urban industrial centers increased in response to wage differentials, seasonal employment fluctuations, and the concentration of technical skills in industrial hubs. By 1848, the French economy had achieved moderate recovery from revolutionary and Napoleonic disruption, with incremental gains in agriculture, industrial output, infrastructure, and urbanization. Coal and iron production had expanded substantially in northern and eastern France. Textile output increased in Lyon and surrounding areas, and rural productivity benefited from secure land tenure and the gradual adoption of improved implements. Urban centers experienced steady population growth, labor specialization, and integration into regional markets, supported by improvements in roads, canals, and early railway lines. Financial institutions, including the Banque de France and private banks, provided credit to agriculture, industry, and infrastructure projects, establishing a foundation for broader economic expansion in the subsequent Second Republic and Second Empire period. The Revolution of 1848 marked a period of immediate political upheaval and temporary economic disruption in France. The abdication of King Louis Philippe and the establishment of the Second Republic created uncertainty in both urban and rural markets. Industrial centers, particularly in Paris, Lyon, Lille, and Rouen, faced interruptions in production as strikes, demonstrations, and political instability reduced labor availability and temporarily constrained trade flows. By mid-1848, textile output in Lyon declined by an estimated 15%, and coal production in northern France fell by approximately 10% relative to 1847 levels. Agricultural markets similarly experienced short-term volatility, with grain prices in Paris rising by roughly 12% due to speculative hoarding and transportation bottlenecks. The Second Republic implemented policies aimed at stabilizing the economy and promoting industrial modernization, albeit over a limited time frame before the rise of the Second Empire in late 1852. National workshops were created in Paris and other urban centers to employ unemployed laborers displaced by industrial shifts and urban migration. At their peak, These workshops employed approximately 6,000 to 8,000 workers in public construction, road maintenance, and artisanal projects. While the workshops addressed immediate unemployment, they were economically unsustainable and were dissolved by 1852, yet they contributed to early efforts in state-directed labor organization and public works. The advent of the Second Empire under Napoleon III marked a period of substantial industrial growth and urban modernization, combining state intervention, infrastructure investment, and the mobilization of private capital. Industrial expansion was facilitated by technological adoption, resource exploitation, and financial institutional development. Coal production in the northern basin increased from roughly 6 million tons in 1850 to 8.5 million tons by 1870, sustaining both urban heating, metallurgical production, and the emerging railway sector. Iron production in Lorraine and Alsace similarly rose from approximately 110,000 tons in 1850 to 220,000 tons by 1870, reflecting increased demand from rail, construction, and armaments manufacturing. The metallurgical workforce in these regions expanded from an estimated 25,000 to over 50,000 employees during the same period, including miners, smelters, and engineers, indicating both employment growth and technical skill concentration. Textile production, particularly in Lyon, Lille, and the Nord-Pas-de-Calais region, expanded under mechanization. In Lyon, the number of silk looms increased from 90,000 in 1850 to approximately 120,000 by 1870, with workforce numbers rising to 250,000, including a significant proportion of female labor. Cotton textile production in northern France, driven by mechanized spinning and weaving, reached nearly 100,000 tons annually by the late 1860s, providing both domestic consumption and exports to Belgium, Switzerland, and colonial markets. The adoption of steam engines in textile factories increased efficiency, with approximately 300 engines operating by 1870, averaging 6 to 8 horsepower each, supporting mechanized looms and carding machines. Railway construction was central to the industrial transformation during the Second Empire. By 1870, France possessed approximately 17,000 kilometers of railway track, linking major urban centers, industrial regions, ports, and border crossings. State investment and concessions to private railway companies facilitated the integration of coal and iron-producing regions with urban markets and export nodes. The railway network enabled a reduction in bulk transport costs by 20 to 25% relative to road or canal systems and supported the regional distribution of industrial products, agricultural goods, and imported raw materials. Approximately 50,000 workers were employed in railway construction and maintenance by 1869, reflecting the labor-intensive nature of early railway infrastructure projects. Urban modernization under the Second Empire further stimulated construction, services, and industrial employment. Baron Georges-Eugène Haussmann's renovation of Paris between 1853 and 1870 involved the demolition of medieval neighborhoods, the construction of wide boulevards, sewer and water systems, public squares, and standardized building facades. The project directly employed an estimated 200,000 workers in construction, masonry, engineering, and related trades over its duration. The expansion of urban infrastructure increased demand for building materials, particularly iron, stone, and cement, stimulating associated industrial sectors. Construction activity also fostered the development of domestic labor markets, and the growth of professional and managerial classes responsible for planning, engineering, and urban administration. Financial institutions played a central role in facilitating industrial expansion. Joint stock banks, particularly Credit Mobilier, founded in 1852, provided capital for railway construction, industrial enterprises, and urban development. Between 1852 and 1870, Credit Mobilier and other similar institutions mobilized over 1.5 billion francs in investments, leveraging both domestic and foreign capital. These banks introduced modern credit instruments, including bonds, shares, and structured loans, enabling long-term industrial investment and the financing of large-scale infrastructure projects. Traditional banks and private investors also contributed, particularly to coal, iron, and textile industries, integrating financial markets with industrial expansion. Agricultural production remained a key component of the French economy, although the sector experienced only moderate mechanization compared with industrial regions. Wheat, barley, and rye yields averaged approximately 25 hectoliters per hectare by the 1860s, reflecting incremental improvements in crop rotation, fertilization, and draft animal use. Viticulture in Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Loire Valley expanded in both volume and export orientation, with wine exports rising to approximately 50 million liters annually by 1870. Agricultural labor remained predominantly rural, with approximately 65% of the population engaged in farming, though seasonal migration to urban areas for construction, textiles, and service labor supplemented household income. Colonial trade continued to influence the French economy, particularly in supplying raw materials and serving as markets for industrial goods. French possessions in North Africa, including Algeria, provided wheat, olive oil, and raw wool, while Indochina contributed rice, timber, and minerals. Caribbean colonies supplied sugar, coffee, and cocoa, supporting both domestic consumption and export revenue. By 1870, colonial trade accounted for roughly 15 to 20% of France's international trade value, integrating the economy into global supply chains while providing both resource security and commercial outlets for industrial products. Technological adoption during the Second Empire extended beyond steam engines and textile machinery. Iron and steel industries increasingly adopted coke-fired blast furnaces, enhancing productivity by 15 to 20% relative to earlier charcoal methods. Mechanization in flour milling, paper production, and chemical industries enabled higher output with reduced labor intensity. By the late 1860s, France possessed approximately 100. The labor force during this period displayed increasing specialization and mobility. Skilled artisans, engineers, and industrial managers formed a growing professional stratum, coordinating production, maintaining machinery, and supervising workforce organization. Unskilled and semi-skilled laborers, including women and children, provided manual labor in factories, mines, and construction projects. Urban labor markets in Paris, Lyon, Lille, and Marseille employed over 1 million workers in industrial, construction, and service sectors by 1870. Wages varied according to skill, sector, and region. Unskilled laborers earned approximately 25 to 35 francs per month, skilled artisans 60 to 80 francs, and technical supervisors or engineers between 100 and 150 francs, supporting modest urban consumption and sustaining local markets. Trade infrastructure, including ports, roads, and canals, complemented industrial expansion. The modernization of Le Havre, Marseille, and Bordeaux ports facilitated both continental and transatlantic trade, handling coal, iron, textiles, wine, sugar, and coffee. Internal transport via roads and canals reduced regional price disparities, with canals such as the Canal du Centre and the Canal de Bourgogne enabling cost-efficient movement of coal, iron, and agricultural products. Combined with the expanding railway network, these improvements integrated regional economies into a national market, supporting industrial growth, urbanization, and domestic consumption. State policy under Napoleon III balanced protectionism with modernization incentives. Tariffs on imported industrial goods, particularly British cotton and iron products, protected domestic manufacturers, while subsidies and concessions encouraged investment in railways, coal, iron, and urban construction. By 1870, protective tariffs and state incentives had contributed to moderate industrial self-sufficiency, enabling France to compete regionally while maintaining trade connections with neighboring countries, including Belgium, Switzerland, and German states. Population growth, urbanization, and migration underpinned the Second Empire's economic expansion. France's population increased from roughly 32 million in 1848 to approximately 36 million by 1870. Urbanization rates rose steadily, with Paris reaching nearly 1.6 million inhabitants, Lyon 500,000, and Lille 200,000, reflecting industrial concentration, labor migration, and the expansion of service sectors. Rural to urban migration provided labor for factories, construction, and infrastructure projects while maintaining agricultural production through seasonal labor distribution and family-based farming systems. By 1870, France's economy under the Second Empire had undergone a substantial transformation. Coal, iron, and textile production had expanded considerably, supported by mechanization, technological adoption, and infrastructure investment. Urban centers had grown in both population and industrial capacity, benefiting from railway integration, port modernization, and state-directed construction projects. Financial institutions facilitated large-scale industrial and infrastructure investment, linking domestic capital to productive sectors. Agricultural production, though moderately mechanized, remained stable, supporting food security and export markets. Colonial trade contributed to resource supply and industrial demand, while technological advances in metallurgy, textiles, and energy supported sustained industrial growth. The collapse of the Second Empire in 1870, following the Franco-Prussian War, led to the establishment of the Third Republic and initiated a period of both economic restructuring and industrial expansion. The defeat by Prussia, combined with the territorial loss of Alsace-Lorraine, imposed significant fiscal and psychological pressures on the French economy. Compensation payments to Germany were stipulated at 5 billion francs in the Treaty of Frankfurt, 1871, placing immediate demands on the national budget and influencing both taxation policy and public borrowing. Despite these constraints, the French economy demonstrated moderate resilience and continued industrial and agricultural development through the late 19th century. Industrialization under the Third Republic progressed at a measured pace compared to Britain and Germany, but it diversified into a broader array of sectors. Coal production in northern France increased from approximately 8.5 million tons in 1870 to nearly 14 million tons by 1913, while iron and steel production rose from 225,000 tons to over 1 million tons, reflecting both the expansion of blast furnaces and the adoption of Bessemer and Siemens-Martin open hearth processes. Industrial labor expanded accordingly, with roughly 1.5 million workers employed in coal, iron, steel, and metallurgical industries by 1910. The northern and eastern industrial basins, particularly around Lille, Valenciennes, and Lorraine, remained centers of heavy industry, while Paris, Lyon, and Marseille diversified into consumer goods, textiles, and chemical production. Textile industries continued to play a significant role. The Lyon silk industry maintained its prominence, producing high-quality silks for both domestic consumption and export, employing an estimated 200,000 workers by the early 20th century. Cotton and wool production in northern France expanded through mechanized spinning and weaving, with approximately 120,000 looms operating in the Lille and Roubaix areas. Technological improvements, including more efficient steam engines averaging 10 to 12 horsepower per unit and mechanized carding and spinning systems, increased output by 15 to 20% relative to mid-19th century levels. Textile exports were concentrated toward Belgium, Switzerland, North Africa, and select colonial markets. Agricultural modernization complemented industrial growth, though mechanization progressed more slowly than in Northern Europe. Crop yields benefited from the introduction of mechanical reapers, threshing machines, and improved plows, particularly in grain-producing regions such as Beauce, Picardy, and Champagne. Wheat yields rose from roughly 25 hectoliters per hectare in the 1870s to approximately 30 hectoliters per hectare by 1910. Viticulture and wine production, central to France's agricultural exports, expanded in Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Rhone Valley, with wine exports reaching an estimated 60 million liters annually by 1913. Livestock production, particularly in the Massif central and western France, provided raw materials for both domestic consumption and emerging industrial food processing industries. Infrastructure development during the Third Republic facilitated both industrial output and internal trade. The national railway network expanded from roughly 17,000 kilometers in 1870 to over 32,000 kilometers by 1913, connecting coalfields, ironworks, industrial hubs, and ports. Key lines included the Paris-Lille, Paris-Lyon, and Paris-Marseille corridors, reducing transport costs for coal, iron, grain, and manufactured goods by approximately 25 to 30% relative to pre-rail transport. Ports such as Le Havre, Marseille, Bordeaux, and Nantes handled increasing volumes of exports and imports, with Le Havre managing 550,000 tons of cargo annually by 1910. Internal waterways, including the Canal du Midi, Canal de Saint-Quentin, and the Rhone-Saône system, supported bulk transport of agricultural and industrial goods, particularly in regions where rail penetration was limited. Financial institutions evolved to accommodate industrial and infrastructural expansion. Joint stock banks, including Crédit Lyonnais and Société Générale, provided capital for industrial investment, railway construction, and urban development. Between 1870 and 1913, these institutions mobilized more than 3 billion francs in domestic and foreign investment, employing modern financial instruments such as bonds, stocks, and credit arrangements. Regional banks, municipal savings banks, and private lenders complemented national institutions, providing financing to small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly in textiles, metallurgy, and agricultural modernization. By 1910, Approximately 1 million depositors held savings accounts in urban and provincial banks, reflecting the increasing integration of capital markets into everyday economic life. Urbanization accelerated in the late 19th century, driven by industrial labor demand and rural-to-urban migration. Colonial expansion under the Third Republic influenced both industrial and agricultural sectors. French colonies in Africa, Indochina, and the Caribbean supplied raw materials such as cotton, rubber, timber, sugar, and minerals, which were integrated into French industrial production. Colonial territories also served as markets for French manufactured goods, including textiles, machinery, and consumer products. By 1913, approximately 15 to 20% of France's foreign trade value was associated with colonies, with imports of raw cotton from North and West Africa increasing to nearly 50,000 tons annually, and rubber imports from Indochina reaching approximately 10,000 tons. Export-oriented infrastructure, particularly ports and rail connections, facilitated the movement of these materials and goods. Technological advancements during this period further accelerated industrial development. The widespread adoption of Bessemer and Siemens-Martin open hearth processes enhanced steel production efficiency, enabling the construction of railways, bridges, and industrial machinery. Steam engines of 15 to 20 horsepower were increasingly utilized in metallurgy, textile, chemical, and food processing industries, while mechanized mills, mechanical looms, and power-driven spindles improved productivity in textile centers. Industrial workshops gradually transitioned into more complex factory systems, integrating specialized labor, technical supervision, and mechanized equipment, resulting in higher output per worker and regional industrial concentration. Agricultural policy and rural finance reflected the need to stabilize production and support modernization. Credit unions, rural cooperative banks, and municipal lending institutions provided loans for investment in implements, drainage systems, and livestock improvements. Mechanization, including reapers, threshers, and horse-drawn plows, facilitated labor efficiency, allowing rural households to maintain production despite seasonal migration to urban centers. Rural labor remained dominant, with approximately 60% of the population employed in agriculture by 1910, though rural-to-urban migration supplied the growing labor needs of the industrial and construction sectors. France's economic performance during this period was periodically influenced by global cycles. The Long Depression, originating in 1873, produced a slowdown in industrial growth, deflationary pressures, and selective unemployment. Coal prices in northern France declined by 15 to 20%, while iron and steel prices fell 10 to 15%, creating a temporary strain on heavy industry. Recovery was achieved by the 1880s through increased domestic consumption, infrastructure investment, and expansion of colonial markets. Protective tariffs were employed to safeguard the domestic industry from foreign competition, particularly in textiles and iron, with import duties reaching 25 to 30% on key industrial goods, balancing international engagement with internal economic stability. Population dynamics influenced both labor supply and demand. France's population increased from approximately 36 million in 1870 to 41 million by 1913, with fertility and mortality rates gradually declining due to urbanization, improved sanitation, and medical developments. Labor migration supplemented regional industry, with northern and eastern France receiving workers from central and western regions, while Paris and Lyon attracted both skilled and unskilled labor from rural areas. Seasonal agricultural labor, particularly in grain, wine, and sugar production, complemented urban labor supply, maintaining agricultural output despite the growth of industrial employment opportunities. By the early 20th century, France had diversified its industrial base into textiles, metallurgy, chemicals, food processing, and consumer goods production. Industrial labor accounted for roughly 25% of total employment, reflecting a substantial, though still moderate, transition relative to Britain and Germany. Agricultural production remained stable and modernized, supporting food security and export capacity. Urban centers expanded in population, infrastructure, and industrial specialization, integrating labor, finance, and transport systems into coherent regional and national economies. Colonial expansion supplied raw materials, supported manufacturing, and contributed to foreign trade integration, while technological adoption in steelmaking, textiles, and mechanized industry enhanced productivity and facilitated long-term economic growth. Railways, canals, and ports integrated domestic and international markets, reducing transport costs by 20 to 30% and facilitating both industrial expansion and agricultural trade. Financial institutions, including national and regional banks, joint stock banks, and credit cooperatives, provided capital for industrial investment, infrastructure projects, and agricultural modernization, linking domestic savings to productive sectors. Wages and labor structures supported growing urban populations and industrial productivity, while protective tariffs and state incentives balanced industrial growth with international trade engagement. By 1914, France had established a stable and moderately diversified industrial economy, supported by urbanization, financial integration, infrastructure expansion, agricultural modernization, and colonial trade. Industrialization was concentrated in northern and eastern basins, Lyon, and the Loire Valley, while Paris functioned as the national center of finance, trade, and manufacturing. Agricultural regions remained productive and moderately mechanized, supporting both domestic and export markets. Technological adoption, transportation networks, and financial institutions laid the groundwork for continued growth, setting the stage for the economic challenges and transformations of the First World War. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 immediately disrupted the French economy, as the nation mobilized both human and material resources for a prolonged conflict. France's northern and eastern industrial regions, including the coal-rich Nord-Pas-de-Calais basin, the iron and steel centers of Lorraine, and textile hubs such as Lille and Lyon, were directly affected by military operations, including bombardments, occupation, and troop movements. Industrial output in affected regions declined sharply. Coal production in the Nord Basin fell by an estimated 40% in 1914 to 1915, while iron and steel output in Lorraine decreased by roughly 35%. Textile production in northern and eastern France fell by approximately 30% due to the combination of labor shortages, material scarcity, and infrastructure damage. Agricultural production suffered similarly, particularly in northern and northeastern France, where battlefronts and occupation disrupted planting, harvesting, and transportation. Arable land in Alsace-Lorraine and the Marne region was either destroyed or requisitioned, leading to declines in cereal output by 25 to 30%. Livestock populations fell as animals were conscripted for military use or killed during conflict, with reductions of approximately 15 to 20% reported in affected regions. The shortage of agricultural labor, exacerbated by military conscription, forced increased reliance on women, the elderly, and seasonal workers, while remaining rural households implemented intensified crop rotation and mechanized cultivation where feasible. France financed the war through a combination of direct taxation, domestic borrowing, and foreign loans. War expenditure rose from roughly 5 billion francs in 1913 to over 30 billion francs by 1918, including costs for armaments, troop mobilization, and logistical support. Taxes were increased on income, property, and consumption, with indirect excise taxes accounting for approximately 40% of total revenue. Domestic borrowing through the issuance of war bonds mobilized savings from both individuals and financial institutions, while foreign loans from Britain and the United States provided essential liquidity for military operations. Public debt increased dramatically, rising from roughly 40 billion francs in 1913 to over 120 billion francs by 1919. Labor mobilization affected both industry and agriculture. Approximately 8 million French men served in the armed forces during the war, creating labor shortages in critical sectors. Industrial firms adapted through the employment of women, older workers, and foreign labor, including Belgian refugees and colonial workers from North and West Africa. Women's participation in factories, particularly in textiles, munitions, and food processing, rose from an estimated 25% of the industrial workforce in 1913 to nearly 40% by 1917 in affected regions. Skilled and semi-skilled female laborers operated machinery, maintained production lines, and supported logistical supply chains, contributing substantially to wartime industrial output. The state assumed a direct role in industrial organization to maximize efficiency and output. Ministries coordinated production, standardized materials, and prioritized munitions, arms, and military vehicles. Heavy industries, including metallurgy, armaments, and chemicals, were directed toward war production, while consumer goods industries operated at reduced capacity or shifted to wartime requirements. Coal mines, steelworks, and textile mills in northern and eastern France were organized under regional commissions, allocating labor and resources according to military priority. By 1918, nearly 70% of industrial output in northern France was directly linked to war production, while non-military production fell by an estimated 50%. Transportation and logistics were essential components of wartime economic management. Railways, roads, and canals were requisitioned for troop movement, supply distribution, and the evacuation of refugees. Northern railway lines, including Paris-Lille and Valenciennes-Lille corridors, carried up to 40,000 tons of military material per week at the height of hostilities, reducing capacity for civilian transport and creating bottlenecks in agricultural and industrial supply chains. Ports such as Le Havre, Dunkirk, and Marseille were militarized, with shipping allocated primarily to troop transport and military imports, while private trade volumes declined by roughly 35%. The German occupation of northern and northeastern France in 1914 to 1918 further constrained economic activity. Industrial and agricultural resources were requisitioned, labor conscripted, and infrastructure damaged. Coal and iron production in occupied regions fell to minimal levels, with output in some areas reduced by as much as 80%. Agricultural requisitions included cereals, livestock, and dairy products, resulting in significant shortages for local populations and contributing to price inflation. The occupied economy operated under German administrative control, with production prioritized for the German war effort. Post-war recovery commenced with the Armistice of November 1918 and the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which imposed reparations on Germany. The reparations, though delayed and partial in payment, provided some fiscal resources for reconstruction, particularly in northern and northeastern France. Reconstruction efforts focused on restoring industrial capacity, rebuilding transport infrastructure, and rehabilitating agricultural land. Coal production in the Nord Basin returned to approximately 80% of pre-war levels by 1923, while steel production in Lorraine reached 75% of 1913 output. Textile production in Lyon and Lille also recovered to near pre-war levels by the early 1920s, supported by mechanization and the replacement of lost skilled labor. Agricultural reconstruction involved clearing unexploded ordnance, restoring irrigation and drainage systems, and replanting crops. Cereal production gradually returned to pre-war levels by 1925, although livestock recovery lagged, with cattle and sheep populations remaining 10 to 15% below pre-war figures through the mid-1920s. Government programs provided credit and technical assistance for farmers, including loans for seed, machinery, and fertilizers. Cooperative agricultural associations facilitated the distribution of modern equipment, while the Banque de France extended credit to agricultural enterprises, stabilizing rural markets. The 1920s, often referred to in France as Les Années Folles, saw a period of relative economic expansion, particularly in urban and industrial centers. Electrification expanded in factories, railways, and urban networks, increasing industrial efficiency and supporting mechanized production. Urban consumption grew, reflecting wage increases in industry, public sector employment, and the return of labor from military service. The automobile industry, construction, and transport sectors expanded, with Paris experiencing increased urban development and modernization projects. Industrial employment in textiles, metallurgy, chemicals, and emerging automotive and electrical industries rose by approximately 15 to 20% between 1920 and 1929. International trade resumed and expanded during the 1920s, with France importing raw materials such as coal, cotton, and oil, while exporting machinery, textiles, wine, and consumer goods. French foreign trade in 1929 totaled roughly 3 billion francs in exports and 3.2 billion francs in imports, reflecting partial balance of trade pressures. Colonial territories supplied key resources, including rubber, cotton, timber, and sugar, contributing to both industrial production and consumer consumption. The French franc was stabilized under monetary policies directed by the Banque de France, providing relative price stability for both domestic and international trade. The global economic downturn following the Wall Street crash of 1929 gradually affected France, culminating in the Great Depression of the 1930s. Industrial production declined by approximately 20% between 1929 and 1933, while urban unemployment rose from roughly 4% in 1929 to over 15% by 1933. Coal and steel industries experienced significant reductions in output, with production in northern France falling by approximately 25%. Textile industries in Lyon and northern regions also suffered declines in production, reflecting reduced domestic consumption and weakened export markets. Agriculture was similarly affected, with falling crop prices, reduced exports, and declining farm incomes. Wheat prices fell by nearly 30% between 1929 and 1933, while wine and livestock revenues declined by 20 to 25%. Rural labor migration to urban areas increased, exacerbating unemployment in industrial centers. Government intervention included modest public works programs, credit facilitation, and limited protectionist measures, including tariffs on industrial and agricultural imports, which partially mitigated the impact of the global downturn. Technological modernization continued despite economic challenges. Electrification of industrial plants progressed, particularly in metallurgy, chemicals, and textile manufacturing, while mechanized milling, power looms, and electric-driven machinery improved efficiency. Railway networks were maintained and partially expanded, integrating industrial regions with ports, urban markets, and agricultural centers. Investment in urban infrastructure, including housing, water, and sanitation, continued, albeit constrained by fiscal limitations during the early 1930s. Labor organizations and social structures evolved in response to economic pressures. Trade unions, established during the 19th and early 20th centuries, gained influence in negotiations over wages, working hours, and labor conditions. Strikes and industrial disputes became more frequent during the economic downturn, reflecting tensions between employers and workers in textiles, metallurgy, and transport sectors. By 1936, union membership reached approximately 1.2 million, contributing to the formation of labor coalitions and the negotiation of social policies, including wage adjustments and collective bargaining agreements. By 1939, French industry had partially recovered from the Great Depression, though unemployment remained higher than pre-1929 levels. Industrial output in coal, steel, textiles, and chemicals reached approximately 85 to 90% of 1929 levels, while agriculture returned to near pre-depression productivity, supported by mechanization, government credit programs, and colonial supply integration. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 marked the beginning of widespread economic mobilization in France, as the nation transitioned from peacetime industry to military preparedness. Initial mobilization included the requisition of raw materials, the expansion of armament production, and the partial conversion of civilian industries to wartime requirements. Industrial output was concentrated in metallurgy, chemicals, machinery, and textiles, with approximately 1.8 million workers employed in these sectors by late 1939. Coal production in northern France, primarily in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais basin, reached roughly 16 million tons in 1939, while steel production in Lorraine and the Ardennes exceeded 2.5 million tons, supplying both domestic military needs and Allied cooperation agreements. The German invasion and subsequent occupation of northern France in 1940 disrupted national economic activity. Following the armistice signed on June 22, 1940, the country was divided into the occupied zone under direct German control and the Vichy-controlled Free Zone in the south. Industrial centers in the occupied regions, including Lille, Valenciennes, and northern Lorraine, were placed under German administrative authority. German authorities requisitioned raw materials, coal, steel, and industrial products, often exceeding 50 to 60% of regional output. Textile factories in northern France, previously producing for domestic and export markets, were redirected to supply German needs, including uniforms and industrial fabrics. Production of armaments and machinery for the French military ceased in the occupied zone, while the Vichy government maintained limited industrial output for domestic use. Agricultural production was similarly affected. Occupation authorities requisitioned cereals, dairy products, and livestock for German consumption, resulting in reduced availability for the French population. Wheat production in the northern and eastern regions fell by approximately 35% relative to 1938 levels, while livestock populations decreased by roughly 20% due to requisitions and feed shortages. In the southern zone, agricultural production remained partially protected, yet transportation bottlenecks, fuel shortages, and labor scarcity limited output. By 1942, overall agricultural production was estimated to be 60 to 70% of pre-war levels, resulting in rationing, price inflation, and the emergence of informal exchange networks to meet consumer needs. Labor mobilization and displacement became critical elements of the occupation economy. The Service du Travail Obligatoire, STO, introduced in 1942, compelled thousands of French workers to contribute to German industry, primarily in metallurgy, chemicals, and armaments. Approximately 600,000 French workers were conscripted into German factories between 1942 and 1944. Simultaneously, the occupation of industrial regions and labor shortages in agriculture necessitated the increased employment of women, adolescents, and elderly laborers in factories, farms, and public works. Urban industrial centers adapted by organizing multi-shift operations to maintain minimal production levels under constrained labor availability. Industrial infrastructure suffered from both requisitions and targeted Allied operations. Factories, railways, and canals in the occupied zone were redirected to serve German logistical requirements. Coal mines and ironworks operated under German supervision, with output prioritized for the Reich's military industry. By 1943, coal production in the Nord Basin was estimated at roughly 10 million tons, compared to 16 million tons in 1939, reflecting both extraction limitations and transportation disruptions. Steel production in Lorraine and the Ardennes declined to approximately 1.2 million tons, representing less than 50% of pre-war levels. Textiles, chemicals, and machinery production similarly contracted, although smaller factories in the southern zone contributed to local consumption and the maintenance of essential infrastructure. The occupation economy relied on centralized control and economic extraction. German authorities imposed quotas for raw materials, manufactured goods, and agricultural products, with monthly requisitions equivalent to roughly 25 to 30% of national industrial output in occupied regions. Financial arrangements, including forced loans and payment in occupation marks, effectively transferred resources from French banks, enterprises, and households to the German economy. Inflation in the French franc accelerated due to currency issuance by the Banque de France to compensate for shortages, with urban price indices rising by 60 to 80% between 1940 and 1943. Black markets expand. Urban transport systems, including electric trams and buses, operated at reduced capacity due to rationed electricity and fuel, limiting internal mobility and constraining commercial activity. Colonial trade partially mitigated resource scarcity. French overseas territories, including Algeria, Morocco, Indochina, and West Africa, supplied raw materials such as rubber, cotton, sugar, and timber. These resources were redirected toward both metropolitan consumption and, indirectly, German logistical networks, as shipping routes were constrained by Allied naval blockades and submarine warfare. Imports from neutral countries, including Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain, supplemented domestic supply chains, providing coal, iron, and select consumer goods. Nevertheless, overall trade volumes remained significantly below pre-war levels, with imports and exports reduced by approximately 40 to 50% relative to 1938. Agricultural labor was supplemented through local organization and cooperative management. Rural households implemented intensified crop rotation, mechanized cultivation where equipment was available, and cooperative harvesting arrangements to offset the conscription of younger male laborers into either German industry or military service. Women and older men performed the majority of farm labor in northern and eastern regions, while seasonal migration from less affected southern areas provided supplemental labor. Food production in these cooperative arrangements sustained local populations and mitigated famine, although caloric intake remained below pre-war levels, averaging approximately 1,800 to 2,000 calories per person per day in urban areas by 1943. The Vichy government in the southern zone exercised limited economic autonomy. Industrial production in Marseille, Lyon, and Toulouse continued at reduced capacity, supplying domestic consumption, civil administration, and limited export. Coal and steel consumption in the south remained constrained, with output levels generally 50 to 60% of pre-war norms. Agricultural production in southern France retained greater stability, though transportation bottlenecks and fuel scarcity restricted distribution to northern urban centers. Public works programs, organized by the Vichy regime, employed displaced labor, maintained infrastructure, and limited industrial projects. Technological and industrial adaptation persisted under constrained circumstances. Factories in both occupied and unoccupied zones implemented maintenance of machinery, small-scale mechanization, and localized energy production to compensate for fuel and material shortages. Electrical power plants in Lyon, Marseille, and other southern cities operated at approximately 70 to 80% of capacity, supporting essential industries, municipal infrastructure, and limited mechanized manufacturing. Metallurgical facilities maintained essential steel and iron output through rationed coking coal and recycled scrap metal, while textile mills operated using pre-war looms adapted to limited electrical and steam power supplies. Urbanization and labor demographics shifted during the occupation. Paris, which had exceeded 3 million inhabitants in 1939, declined slightly due to migration, evacuation, and requisitioning of residential and commercial buildings for German administration and military housing. Lyon, Marseille, and Toulouse retained stable populations, though urban employment and industry and services contracted by roughly 30% in comparison to 1938. The workforce increasingly relied on women, older men, adolescents, and foreign or colonial laborers, reflecting both conscription losses and occupation policies. Inflation and market adaptation defined civilian economic conditions. Consumer prices in occupied urban centers increased by approximately 70 to 100% between 1940 and 1943, with basic foodstuffs, fuel, and clothing becoming scarce commodities. Black markets expanded, supplying an estimated 20 to 30% of urban caloric consumption and providing access to textiles, fuel, and other necessities otherwise unavailable through ration channels. Currency stabilization efforts, including management of occupation marks and domestic francs, mitigated hyperinflation risk, but could not prevent widespread price increases due to supply constraints, requisitions, and logistical disruption. By 1944, the French economy remained severely disrupted. Industrial production in occupied northern and eastern regions continued to operate at roughly 50% of pre-war capacity. Agricultural output remained 60 to 70% of 1938 levels, and urban consumption was constrained by rationing and limited market availability. Labor shortages persisted despite increased female and auxiliary employment. Colonial imports partially offset shortages, yet overall economic activity remained fragmented and heavily dependent on both occupation directives and limited southern zone production. Rail, canal, and port infrastructure required extensive maintenance, while industrial facilities suffered from equipment wear and wartime damage. Black market activity and informal exchange networks played critical roles in sustaining urban populations and maintaining minimal economic continuity.